Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back to Podcast by George. Well, it's the weekend, and she's back, Laura Belin from Bleeding Heartland, and they've had a cadre of stories in Bleeding Heartland that you need to follow, that you need to be aware of. I like to highlight them, bring them on as much as I can. She's very busy. It takes a lot of work to do these kind of stories, but I'm proud and happy to bring it to you. And you know, I mentioned with the most recent podcast with Stephen W. Schmidt, I was wearing a polo. I mean, it was 65 degrees here in Iowa in mid-December almost, and now I got the winter merch on, you'll notice. I mean, we're getting back into more seasonal weather finally. But honest to God, if that isn't an indication of climate change, I don't know what is. But that's where we're at today. And I wanted to start, well, oddly enough, well, first of all, let's welcome her in. Laura, welcome back to Podcast by George.
Oh, thanks, George. Always pleasure.
We're going to start with a story not from Bleeding Heartland, but it's going to lead into your reporting in the Bleeding Heartland, and it's a story that I know you saw this morning, and it's from the Des Moines Register. It says it's from the investigations heading in the Des Moines Register. Register investigation. Unemployed workers turn to state for the help in pandemic and now must repay thousands. Okay, so here's how it reads. Audrey Birdsell's daughter begged her to stop working. Birdsell, 84, a survivor of bladder, breast, skin, and colon cancer, underwent surgery to remove part of her tongue in January. She suffers from a condition in which her immune system attacks the mucous membrane in her mouth. The condition causes painful sores and can lead to more cancer. Well, in mid-March, coronavirus cases were rising. Birdsell told her boss at a Quick Star convenience store in Calmer. Now, that's up in northeast Iowa. I mean, these are little bitty towns that we're talking about up there, folks. I mean, probably the major employer in town's the Quick Star, that she needed a leave of absence because her family wanted her to stay home. Birdsell applied for unemployment after she heard a new federal program covered workers who were vulnerable to COVID-19. The state paid for 5 weeks. Then in June, Iowa Workforce Development sent her a letter explaining she never should have qualified for benefits. An administrative law judge ordered her to repay what she had received. A little $3,530 stipend. Well, I don't know where to start on that story. You know, I'll start at a place a lot of people won't. And I look at that story and go, my God, what is an 84-year-old woman in Calmer? I think she lives in Ocean, Iowa, up there. What is she doing working at a Quick Star at age 84? People will say, well, isn't that wonderful? She's still working or whatever. I'm like, no, that is screwed up, man. I'm telling you something. That woman should not have to work. And I look at her medical condition and I think, is that why she's having to work? Is she having to pay off medical bills associated with those surgeries? Could she not afford the co-pays and the deductibles on Obamacare or whatever plan that she's enrolled in, and that's why she's having to do this? Then she applies for unemployment, and it's part of the extension probably, I don't know, for this CARES Act that I bitch about all the time. That money should have started down with her. It should have started with Audrey. It didn't. It started with Amazon. It started with Boeing. It started at the top. $5 trillion went to those people. And then they gave a little money on down the food chain a little further. People wanted the state governments to have it. God, we got to get it to the state governments. No, because why? Look what happened here. Honest to God.
Well, Tyler Jett has done some great reporting for the Des Moines Register
Yeah.
on this. And unfortunately, this poor woman's story is not an isolated case. I mean, he reviewed a number of contested unemployment cases from late July, and he was only looking at a very narrow period in late July. He looked at hundreds of cases, and he found more than 100 where the state was asking people to pay unemployment benefits back. And there were other people in this same position. They had underlying health conditions that put them at higher risk for COVID-19. And that was specifically what this pandemic unemployment assistance program, which was part of the CARES Act, it was specifically designed for people like that, and that group, that they needed to stop working to protect themselves from this novel virus. And yet now some of these people are being told that they have to pay thousands back to the state because they weren't available to work. When you're on unemployment, typically you have to show that you're available to work and that you're applying for other positions and so on. And so that is what the state is claiming, that some of these people were not available for work. But that's the whole point, right? We wanted these people to stay home so that they didn't get sick and die because they were at higher risk of dying. I mean, it's a complete travesty, and my heart goes out to anyone in that situation. And like I said, Tyler Jett, I mean, his reporting is only scratching the surface because he's just looking at a few cases that came up in July, but there must be many more Iowans who got caught up in this, who thought that they were, that they were eligible, that they were entitled to this unemployment. And I agree with you that those should be some of the first people. The CARES Act money should go for urgent needs like testing, PPE, and other mitigation, and then to help people who are in that kind of position where they're especially vulnerable to the virus.
Well, and to stimulate the economy, to do everybody the most benefit, everybody from Robert Reich, an economist that I like to follow, and some of these other people, they put the money at the bottom, it'll go to the top. Those people will get their money. It has to. She's not going to hang on to that money. She's going to spend it. It'll circulate. It'll benefit us all. Now, I want to take this a step further because I read that story this morning. Laura, you read that story. Do you think Kim Reynolds read that story? Is she aware of this? And the reason I asked this, let me cite this little story that I like to tell. There's an artist, a musician that I really like, Jason Isbell. He wrote a song, and it's really poignant, and it's actually based in truth, and it's about a sharecropper down in the southern part of the United States. And during the Depression, and they're starving down there. I mean, it's a man and a woman, 7 kids living in a tent, basically, sharecropping. And his wife writes a letter to FDR. And the guy's out behind horses in a plow, a sharecropper, a couple of weeks later, and up pulls a government car. A couple of guys get out and say, put down that plow. I mean, we got a solution for you. We're here to help. We're the government. This is what we do. We've got this project coming up, the TVA. We're going to electrify the South. You're going to go to work for them, and you're never going to have to live in a tent again. And that's what somebody like FDR can do when the buck stops there. What do you think Kim Reynolds is going to do?
I don't think she's going to do anything. I mean, I don't know whether she reads the Des Moines Register or doesn't read it, but I do know that recently when there was a case filed charging that Iowa's OHSA, which is the workplace safety regulator, that they have not done their job, not only related to COVID, but years before COVID. They hardly do any on-site inspections. They rarely issue citations. And it was a very detailed report. I mean, hundreds of pages of supporting documents. And the governor's office just immediately issued a statement saying, we're confident that Iowa OHSA is doing everything correctly and that they're going to be vindicated and that they're doing the best they can. And I mean, there was no way that her staff had time to thoroughly look into what was alleged in this report. It was just a knee-jerk reaction. And so I anticipate that the governor will defend the Iowa Workforce Development Agency, will defend its director, and will not really demand any changes in this. That they'll just say we're applying the law properly. I just haven't seen any sign that this governor is interested in protecting Iowa workers really in any sense. And we saw that with the meatpacking plants. I mean, she repeatedly went on TV saying that these meatpacking plants were doing everything they could to protect their workers. It was just a lie. I mean, it may have been what the plant managers were telling her and the CEOs, but it was not factual. And yet she stipulated to that many times on television.
People just don't have any idea of what's going on. And thank God for Laura Belin and the reporting in Bleeding Heartland, because this is going to dovetail very nicely into an article that you just posted. And well, first of all, I want to call it for what it's worth. You didn't read the Des Moines Register. I know you shouldn't listen to podcasts by George, but my God, Kim Reynolds, do something to help Audrey up there in northeastern Iowa. 84-year-old working at a quick star with these surgeries and maladies, and all she's trying to do is stay alive. And the state of Iowa pulls the rug out from under her, and the governor can stop that. What a PR coup that would be, if nothing else. But like you said, I'm not going to hold my breath for that one. Well, anyway, how about a little insult to the injury here that we're talking about this morning? This article from Laura in Bleeding Heartland, the headline reads, "Exclusive, Iowa governor overspent the office budget before tapping the CARES Act." Well, Governor Kim Reynolds, it reads, would have had a large shortfall. She would have had a large shortfall for the fiscal year that ended June 30th this year without a transfer of federal funds from the Coronavirus Act Relief and Economic Security Act. There's a long name for it. The CARES Act, as Laura spelled it out there, financial reports show. Well, okay, so this is just the example that we were talking about. This money came down to the state. And then where did it go? Did it go to the woman, Mrs. Birdsell up there in Northeast Iowa? No, Laura, where did it go?
Well, the state got about $1.2 billion for this coronavirus relief fund through the CARES Act. And the governor has exclusive control over how that money is spent. The state legislature, there were some Democrats who wanted to establish some oversight in the governor's spending, and the Republican lawmakers rejected that in June. So basically, it's Kim Reynolds can do whatever she wanted. And she put a huge amount of that in an unemployment trust fund that benefits businesses, actually. The biggest chunk of the CARES Act money she's put in a fund so that the businesses don't have to see their unemployment taxes go up. So that was a high priority for her. But she did allocate about $1 million to cover what they call COVID staffing. And of that $1 million, just a little bit less than $450,000 has been spent so far. And all of that was spent on supporting salaries and benefits for members of the governor's permanent staff. Now, I have asked what's going to happen to the remaining $551,000 in this COVID staffing fund, and I have not gotten an answer. I think it's very likely that the bulk of that money will be transferred to cover governor's staff salaries in the current fiscal year, but I don't have any evidence of that yet. But that's something I'm going to be watching very closely. But right now, this almost half of it just went straight to cover her own shortfall. And as I demonstrated in that piece, she was overspending her budget months before there was a pandemic. So I really wonder what was their game plan. On most years, the federal government doesn't pass a huge relief fund that the governor has control over. So I really wonder what they would have done to balance the books without that CARES Act money.
Okay, the next question is, I know you're going to follow it, Laura. You're going to report on it, but she ought to be hammered on this. I mean, are people after her on this? Is she getting questioned about this? Does this come up at the news conferences that you're not included in, or is it, just your reporting?
I haven't seen her asked about this latest thing at any news conference. When I originally reported that the governor had used CARES Act money to cover her staff salaries in September, Kathy Abradovich did ask about that at the next press conference, which was a few days later. And some other Iowa media covered that, but that was like a one-day story for them. So when I learned in October that the governor, that instead of being directly paid, having money directly go from the coronavirus relief fund to the governor's office, they routed this money through Iowa's Homeland Security Department. So that if you just are looking at the published records, it looks like the money was going to Homeland Security for this COVID staffing, right? But really, it should show up as a payment to the governor's office. It's very difficult to dig. You can find it if you're really looking hard, but it's difficult to determine that any money did go to the governor's office. And I don't think that Governor Reynolds has ever been asked about that part of it. And she wasn't asked. She only had one press conference this week, and she didn't take very many questions. And most of the questions were related to the COVID-19 vaccine and some of the school restrictions. So, which isn't surprising. Those are huge issues for people to ask about.
By the way, I want to just mention that on podcasts by George and elsewhere in your reporting, you were saying a long time ago that these COVID deaths, the statistics are being underreported. A lot of people think they're exaggerated, they're overreported. And Laura was saying, no, they're being underreported. And of course, that's what we're finding out. And so now our daily deaths are in the hundreds sometimes.
Right. And that's partly they're catching up to what I reported last month. I mean, actually, I sounded the alarm about this in July. I started asking the Iowa Department of Public Health in early July, what is your method for counting someone, an Iowan, as dying of COVID-19? And I got asked that question more than a dozen times, and I've never gotten a response. This week, in a press conference that I was excluded from, suddenly the Department of Public Health said, well, we used to count deaths this way, and now we're going to count them the way the CDC does. And in fact, that was what I reported last month, that this, if you look at the CDC reported statistics for Iowa, we'd lost hundreds more than what the state website was reporting. So it was, in effect, they were confirming what I had reported, that they've been undercounting the deaths for some time. But before this press conference this week, they wouldn't even say what their previous method was for counting the deaths. So it's very frustrating. The lack of transparency is frustrating. And so now every day this week, we've seen huge numbers of deaths reported, but those are being added to dates in the last month or 6 weeks. So actually yesterday, when they reported more than 100 deaths, most of those were from November, and they were just adding to every date in November. And most of the deaths that have happened so far in December haven't even been reported yet. So the highest, the most deadly days so far were November 19th, when at least 66 Iowans died, and that number could go up as they continue to process more death certificates. But I mean, I'm glad that we're finally learning the truth about it, but it was very frustrating not to be able to get an answer. And again, if I had been able to raise that question at any of the press conferences over the summer, maybe at least we would have found out what they were doing and why it was not consistent with what the CDC was reporting.
Well, thank God for your reporting of the truth, and that we're finally getting it, Laura. And I want to, before we run out of time today, I want to jump into the mud a little bit on a reporting that you had, and it has to do with the venerable outgoing U.S. Representative Steve King. My God, it's like, I tell people they just remind me of like stepping in dog poop. You can't get it off your shoe. I mean, the guy is still out there saying and doing things. We'll be rid of him soon, folks, to a certain degree, I hope. But anyway, this article reads, outgoing U.S. Representative Steve King, this was written by Laura, was one of the 23 Republican members of Congress who sought unsuccessfully this week to have the U.S. Supreme Court throw out Pennsylvania's presidential election. Now, you've heard about that. And Steve King was in on it. King said fellow House Republicans signed a brief, America's, what do you call that, Laura? It's a legal term, supporting U.S. Representative Mike Kelly's effort to block certification of Pennsylvania's 2020 election results. Kelly argued that the state legislature's provision of no excuse absentee voting violated both the Pennsylvania and U.S. constitutions. Okay, so that's what the guy in Pennsylvania said. And then Steve King says, yeah, I'm up with that. I'm going to get in on that. And Laura looks at that and says, well, wait a minute.
Right. Yeah. Well, and yesterday, I'm working on an update, because yesterday, King and 105 other House Republicans joined a brief supporting this other lawsuit, this Texas lawsuit that's trying to throw out the results in 4 states that voted for Biden. Governor Reynolds actually said yesterday that she wished she could have joined that lawsuit. Tom Miller, our Democratic Attorney General, didn't sign Iowa onto that effort. But it's absurd. I mean, Iowa has no excuse mail voting. Iowa allows some late arriving absentee ballots to be counted. There are other states that voted for Trump that have very similar things. Montana, North Carolina, actually Texas itself extended the early voting period because of the pandemic. So it's completely ludicrous to go to the Supreme Court and say we need to throw out the election results just in these 4 states that Joe Biden won. And all 50 states have certified the results. All 50 states have certified their electors. And yet we see more than 100 Republicans in the House and 18 now state attorneys general. And now Kim Reynolds says she wishes she could join them in this lawsuit. It's I couldn't have imagined it even a few years ago, and it's a complete travesty. I mean, elections are not legitimate to these people unless Republicans win.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that point about Kim Reynolds, because, and also with Steve King, finally, maybe we're going to get rid of this guy. This guy doesn't introduce legislation, doesn't sponsor anything, doesn't really do much in Congress at all, and then here's this flurry of activity. And then, when it comes to the political wrestling that is politics, Kim Reynolds won't answer these questions directly. Sometimes she's not even answered or asked in her news conferences, but she goes on WHO. Now, folks, that's my alma mater. When I was there, it was not the way that it is now. So, we were fair. We had the fairness doctrine. We tried to do the best job that we could. Our news reporting was a hell of a lot better than it is now. But she gets on there, and it's like WWF. She's at home. She's amongst her people. So she admits and says, straight-faced, that she would have joined this. The thing with Tom Miller and the fact that he was prevented from joining other class action, explain that a little.
Yeah, this is an agreement that the governor sort of strong-armed our attorney general into in 2019. So he can't join these multi-state lawsuits without her permission. So yes, he wanted to join the brief defending the 4 states and saying, no, we shouldn't throw out millions of people's votes. And there's no evidence that fraud occurred. And this whole lawsuit is inappropriate. You can't challenge an election after it happened and say, well, the rules were wrong. You have to challenge the rules before the election. Pennsylvania passed a law last year expanding voting by mail. And then they wait until weeks after the election to challenge that in court. So the whole thing is in bad faith and illegitimate and an affront to democracy. And I think that the Supreme Court will reject this lawsuit, but I hope that they reject it with a really strong statement and not just a 1-sentence order that says we're not taking this up, because this is really, it's just outrageous. How would Kim Reynolds like it if California or Massachusetts asked the Supreme Court to throw out Iowa's election?
Well, how would Kim Reynolds like it if she was 84 years old and living in Northeast Iowa after multiple cancer surgeries, got $3,200 of unemployment benefits so she could stay home and not die of COVID, and then the state wants the money back? That's kind of where we're at. That's the world that we live in, and Laura Belin and Bleeding Heartland has got a lot of it, and I put the URL up on the podcast so that people can go there and check it out. Encourage everybody to do that. Laura, I want to give you a last word. Anything that you're working on or anything that you've written recently that you'd like to highlight here before we take it out on our Friday with Laura segment?
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm still digging into analyzing the 2020 election results, but I'm not done digging on this CARES Act spending, and I'm hoping to uncover more about how that money has been spent and whether it's been spent to the benefit of Iowans or the benefit of some government agencies or the governor's office itself. So I would just say stay tuned.
Thanks, Laura, again, for coming on Podcast by George.
Oh, thanks, George.
And folks, if you like this, if you appreciate Laura's reporting, go to bleedingheartland.com, and we'll get her on as often as we can here at Podcast by George. You can find us at podcastbygeorge.com. Just click on the badge, the little icon where you'd like to subscribe, and then each and every time a new podcast is posted, you'll be notified, and you can check Laura and all of our other outstanding guests. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.